So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeanette Pablo, Director of the Climate Equity Initiative at Clean Air Task Force. I'd like to welcome everyone for joining our webinar on community benefits, plans, and agreements. Just a few housekeeping notes. All participants have been muted to limit background noise during the presentation, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. There are two ways to engage during the webinar. Please use the chat box for commentary or support and technical needs. Also links you might want to share. And then the Q&A box is for questions to the panelists at the end of the session. So you can populate the Q&A box as you think of a question, and then we'll get to it at the end. Also, the presentation is being recorded. And after the webinar, I'll send out an email in a day or two with all three reports and also a link to the recording. So by way of background, Clean Air Task Force is a global nonprofit organization working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change. With over 25 years of internationally recognized expertise on climate policy, science, and law, and a commitment to exploring all potential solutions, CATF is a pragmatic, non-ideological advocacy group focused on climate change and the clean energy transition. CATF launched the Climate Equity Initiative in May 2021 to conduct research and analysis and to work with environmental justice leaders, advocates, and community residents to identify barriers, challenges, and potential opportunities in environmental justice communities, advocate change and adoption of solutions to systemic barriers and challenges that create and perpetuate environmental injustice, and ensure that CATF itself has a clear-sighted understanding of the needs and concerns of environmental justice communities. Today's program will consist of this brief introduction, a presentation of the reports, a panel discussion, followed by Q&As. We're going to be discussing two reports by BW Research, sponsored by Clean Air Task Force. Understanding Community Benefits Plans and the Potential for Change, and Community Benefits, a survey of perspectives from 3 communities. A third report, Community Benefits Agreements, Federal Guidelines, Case Studies, and Best Practices, is a result of a collaboration between Clean Air Task Force Climate Equity Initiative and Columbia University's Climate School through the Master's Degree Capstone Project. Since we aren't presenting this third report, I'm just going to give a brief description. The report aims to bridge federal guidelines, developer understandings, and community priorities to support more equitable outcomes in CBA development and implementation. The first section examines lessons learned from existing CBAs negotiated by different types of developers, including universities, real estate, and renewable energy companies. The second section draws lessons from these case studies to identify best practices for community benefits agreements, development and implementation, and details steps developers should take to build trust and partnerships with community groups. The final section of this report provides an overview of existing guidelines and recommendations regarding community benefit agreements that have been developed by federal agencies, particularly the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. These recommendations identify how the federal government can better provide information and guidance to help scale best practices for CBA adoption. Community benefits agreements, federal guidelines, case studies, and best practices is intended to inform CBA development so that these agreements can deliver more equitable outcomes for communities throughout the build-out of clean energy technologies. I'd like to give a special shout out to the authors of the report, the students from Columbia, Samuel Levine, Ale Pacheco, Wei-Yi Shen, and Bi-Yu Yang. So today, we're grateful to be joined by 6 experts. Kara Hoving, my colleague and today's moderator, give a little wave, Kara, joined Clean Air Task Force in October of 2021 as a climate equity associate. In this role, she conducts data collection, research and analysis for Climate Equity Initiative, and Kara is also the project manager for all of our work on community benefits and agreements. Prior to Clean Air Task Force, Kara completed her Master's of Environmental Management degree at the Yale School of the Environment, where she focused her coursework on climate change and environmental justice policy. She has previously worked as a policy research assistant at the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and as an urban, agriculture, and sustainable development researcher in Cairo, Egypt. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Iowa. Montina Cole has nearly 3 decades of private and public sector experience regarding the energy industry. She is currently the principal of Jai Green Consulting Firm, where she works at the intersections of climate policy, racial equity, and resilience. She previously served as the first senior counsel for environmental justice and equity at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where she helped lead the Environmental Justice and Equity Integration Initiative, including creation of the agency's first equity action plan. Most recently, Montina was named an Open Society Foundation's Leadership in Government Fellow. Earlier in her career, she spent almost 20 years practicing energy law in corporate law firms, representing a wide variety of clients, and she also served as senior attorney in an environmental organization. Daniel Cardenas currently serves as the CEO, president, and chairman of the board of the American Indian Infrastructure Association and the National Tribal Energy Association, both trade associations representing the interests of Native American tribes across the United States. He is also the owner of 7 Generations Infrastructure, a tribal renewable energy infrastructure development firm. Daniel served as an elected member of the Pitt River Tribal Council, a federally recognized tribe representing the Hamawi Band for over 15 years from 1992 to 2016. Daniel has served on various nonprofits, including the Wyoming Food Bank of the Rockies, the Wind River Tourism Council, and he co-founded the Wind River Community Foundation and Knowledge River, an indigenous energy STEM initiative. Christina Angelides leads the Elemental Policy Lab at Elemental Accelerator, where she supports portfolio companies on policy strategy issues, manages the Policy Lab's Fellows Program, and works with coalitions, partners, and government and community leaders to advance the most innovative policy ideas that will accelerate climate and equity solutions. Christina brings more than 15 years of experience, and she has advanced policy and programs at the city, state, and federal levels and across a range of climate and clean tech issues such as building decarbonization, transportation electrification, climate adaptation, clean power, and industrial energy efficiency. Prior to Elemental Accelerator, Christina was a senior level strategic advisor and project director at the National Resources Defense Council, an international environmental advocacy nonprofit organization. Over her time at NRDC, Christine was responsible for a number of major initiatives, including the American Cities Climate Challenge, a multi-million dollar accelerator to help 25 mayors and their cities pass and implement over 200 climate policies and programs. Kai Steger is the director of policy research at BW Research Partnership, where he leads client assignments for state and local governments, foundations, nonprofit organizations, and the private sector. His work focuses on the intersection of clean energy with economic development, labor markets, housing, innovation, and equity. Kai has 15 years of experience in project leadership, strategy communications, and policy advocacy roles. Last but not least, Phil Jordan is Vice President of BW Research Partnership and the Executive Director of the Economic Advancement Research Institute. Phil has authored numerous reports, including national energy employment studies, regional diversity and inclusion assessments, and comprehensive reports on industry clusters from healthcare to technology. Phil is currently an Associate Fellow at the Ash Center at Harvard University, where he focuses on the impacts of globalization and automation on the workforce. He previously served as director of the San Diego and Imperial Region Center of Excellence, where he provided training and skill gap analysis to the 9 community colleges in his region. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Connecticut and his JD and Certificate in Environmental and Land Law from Boston College. It is now my great pleasure to hand the mic over to Kai to begin the presentation. Thank you, Kai.
Thanks, Jeanette. Thanks, everybody. I think, Phil, you were queued up to lead us off. So, Phil, take us away.
Great. Thank you so much. Jeanette, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today to discuss this very important topic on community benefits plans and agreements and their potential. I'll just give you a little bit of background on BW Research on the next slide. BW Research is a research consulting firm that focuses really heavily on the intersection of economic development, workforce development, innovation, and increasingly, and over the last 15 years, heavily focused around decarbonization. We really are focused on community improvement and empowerment, which is why this project has been so exciting for us to work on with the Clean Air Task Force. Before I get started on some of our key takeaways, I'd like to take a moment to just thank some very important people whose names are all listed here. But this work really was incredibly, this incredibly important work was facilitated by a number of leaders. There are a number of additional folks from the Clean Air Task Force and BW Research and other partners who really work together to make this happen. I see many of them are participating in the webinars as attendees today, but want to take a moment to acknowledge those teams that we worked with so closely, and also our friends in the 3 communities where we spent a great deal of time over the last 2 years, in the Ironbound of Newark, New Jersey, in the Shiprock area of Navajo Nation, and in the river parishes, specifically St. James and St. John the Baptist in Louisiana, as well as the hundreds of survey respondents who took their time from those communities to respond to our survey. We go to the next slide. I'll give a little bit of context about what we're doing here, right? Why are we here? This project really started off, the research aspect of this project started off with a comprehensive national survey that we presented last summer on findings from all over the country, focused on how different communities that have been identified through a number of different channels as being important for this clean energy transition, this decarbonization transition, view climate equity and environmental justice and how they think about those terms and what it really means to them. So we looked at neighborhoods that are minoritized neighborhoods. We looked at communities that had high environmental burdens. We looked at low-income rural communities, low-income urban communities, tribal communities, et cetera. And we got some really, really interesting quantitative findings about how people perceived environmental justice and climate equity. We realized very quickly in working with our advisory team, many of whom are here on this panel, or several who are here on this panel, that we needed to spend a lot more time in the communities themselves to enhance our learning. And what we really wanted to figure out was, given all of the new money from the Inflation Reduction Act, from the CHIPS Act, from the infrastructure bill, as well as many state initiatives and other programs, what really should these community benefits plans and agreements look like if we want to make sure that they're tailored to help people in those communities where they're focused? So we had 3 key questions that we have here, ultimately focusing around how can we think about the Department of Energy's community benefits plan framework to make sure that we can maximize the priorities and needs and areas of importance for the communities in which they will operate. So what I'm going to talk about today is a survey of communities that we embarked upon. As you saw in previous slide, there were over 1,000 respondents from the 3 communities where we had spent a number of months in close contact, doing interviews and focus groups, community roundtables and observations and other studies. What we really wanted to do is conduct a survey so we could understand what are some similarities and differences, and what are some key learnings that we can draw from what individuals living in these 3 different communities might prioritize around community benefits. Now, for those who are not familiar with these communities, very briefly, we have an urban community in New Jersey, part of the city of Newark, Ironbound, which is a community, a vibrant community that has a large immigrant population, a lot of native Spanish and Portuguese speakers, and a whole lot of industry, lots of pollution burden, lots of trucking, lots of power plants, waste incinerators, all kinds of things. And the next community is the river parishes in Louisiana. So if you think of this as going west from New Orleans, it's also known as Cancer Alley, one of the highest rates of cancer anywhere in the world, and a very large petrochemical industry, but pretty rural, pretty spread out. And then we have the Shiprock area, which is near Farmington, New Mexico, part of the Navajo Nation, which has been dominated by a couple of large coal-fired power plants, one of which has already closed, the other which is closing. Again, a very rural area and obviously a tribal community. So we want to do this survey to understand what are some key differences and similarities, and what can we learn from how folks respond. So we'll go through a few of the key survey findings on the next slide. So the first it's a really important takeaway, I think, from the survey, is that a significant majority of residents in all three communities really had a bad taste in their mouth from developers. They either felt as though they had not fulfilled promises, they had not engaged the right way, they really had a bad taste in their mouth from working with developers. We think that probably contributes to why, despite the fact that the community benefits plan was generally positively received, there was a lot of skepticism around the idea of community benefits plans. We also saw that small business owners and environmental groups were really strong favorites as the entities that should be driving. The big companies were really challenging in particular for a lot of these communities because they had been burned before. One key takeaway in number 4 here that I think is really important is that there were big differences across the benefits that communities wanted as the most important. But there was a general theme that was around environmental quality and basic services. And actually, that was much more important than community-related clean energy. So we weren't sure if we were going to find that people really wanted, community solar or, more renewables. But what we really found was that they were focused around, most of them don't want a whole lot more development. If they could get development that doesn't impact the environment or can clean up the environment, that's really what they want. And then they have a lot of needs in these communities for specific programs. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through the next few slides that have some more detailed findings. So I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about everything. This slide seems to have some technical challenges with it. But let's just go to the next one, easier. So here we have you heard about community benefits plan? We were I was actually kind of surprised that greater than 1 out of 5 people had ever heard of these things. I'm not sure I knew what they were a couple of years ago. In terms of what we were thinking about here, but there has been a lot of conversation about community benefits plans, and these are communities that would hear about them, right? This is where a lot of people are targeting development. And what we found is there was a pretty big jump in the beginning of the survey and the end of the survey of how people felt about community benefits plans, which means they may have known something about these plans, but they didn't really know a whole lot about them. So as we were going through the course of asking what they might like to see in a community benefits plan, when you start adding the things in that they might like to see and thinking that that's a possibility, then they started liking it a lot more. So when you start getting around 80% support, 10 to 15% of people are going to oppose everything no matter what it is. So you're doing pretty well when you're between 73 and 81% support. Next slide. So who should be involved? There were a couple of surprises here. One was that religious organizations were pretty low on the list of who should be involved in the community benefit plan. And the small business owners were actually the highest in most communities, as well as environmental groups. So it's interesting that there's a lot of nuance in here that we need to consider. So, for example, when we were in Navajo Nation, we heard very clearly that they wanted to hear from scientists, right, and academics who speak their language, right, and that would be who they would listen to, and everyone else they're basically not that interested in talking to. So the point here is there are some definite these are sort of broad categories, but there's a lot of nuance to think about in each of those. But you can see that there's generally, it's a big table. There's room for a lot of seats at it, but some of the key areas really are those small business owners and environmental groups, and in Ironbound, certainly, not surprisingly, with the amount of organized labor there, an important role for labor to play as well. Go to the next slide. So what are some of the most popular benefits in each of the community? What you see here is, again, as we talked about more generally, basic services, which I would consider to be housing, mental health and substance, and climate resilience, homelessness, etc. And then lots of information across different categories, lots of support for things like improving air quality, improving water quality, and those types of issues. So really, really important, as you know, really remembering that in many of these places, the negative impacts of these developments are pretty severe. And in a place like Ironbound, where they already have, you know, 3, potentially 4 new, a 4th new power plant going in, along with a waste incinerator and a wastewater treatment plant, they aren't really interested in much of any new development, right? I think they've sort of said we've got enough. So really important to be focusing on those environmental issues. I'm getting pretty short on time, so let's go to the next slide and just talk about what some of those environmental benefits are. Water quality and air quality, you know, we did get pictures from folks showing us the color of the water coming out of the pipes in some of these communities, not looking like anything I'd like to drink or bathe in. Air quality, an obvious concern in a lot of places, and lots of the climate resilience and stormwater drainage and flooding issues. I will note that some of the more popular items like community energy efficiency, community solar panels, and charging stations were pretty low on the list for folks overall in comparison. So just helpful to I think, as people are thinking about how they might want to address communities, to think about some of those topics. All right, next slide, please. So before I turn it over to Kai to talk about community benefits plans, I would just like to underscore the point that each of these communities told us different things. Yes, there were similarities across what they were looking for, but there is no one-size-fits-all approach. That's what our survey taught us. Individual respondents want different things. Subgroups within communities want different things. And I mentioned a big table, and it's important to make sure that this survey shows you need a big table and you need to make sure that everyone is invited. So we're excited about the release of this report. We're going to have a link to the final formatted report up here in just a few moments. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kai Steger, who has been working on interpreting all the information that we've collected over the last couple of years and really channeling it into how to think about it in the context of community benefits plans as prescribed by DOE and EPA. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kai.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Phil. Yeah, to Phil's point, this is really exciting research that we get to do that sits squarely within a lot of the areas we care about. The community benefits plan in particular, policy wonks really love this policy. We started hearing about it, you know, a year and a half ago when DOE first released information on it, and because it's new and because of the potential ramifications of something this big, we wanted to spend some time understanding what we could, learning more about it where that was possible, and then really talking to folks on the ground who are already engaging in community benefit processes, be it the developers, be it the community advocates, be it folks in government, to try to see how this community benefits plan connected into and aligned with what we were hearing and what we were learning in communities. So that's what we're going to do here. Try to keep it tight so we can make our way over to our panel. Very briefly, in terms of context of what the CBP is, the Community Benefits Plan, which I'll abbreviate typically as CBP. As Phil said, there are 2 reports that we'll be linking in the Q&A right after this. They're deep, kind of comprehensive reports looking at both the surveys we've done and also the community benefit plans. Let me just walk through a couple key steps here. One way to think about the community benefits plan is really it's a framework that lays out an approach, a process for how you can achieve greater benefits for communities and for workers through clean energy. It's something that has been tried before, but this is certainly the first of its kind at DOE. And what's exciting about it is one of several things that are exciting about it, but also potentially challenging down the road, is the community benefits plan is required on just about all applications for DOE climate and clean energy funding. And because of recent legislation, there's over $100 billion within DOE that is being dispersed primarily through competitive grant application processes. And the CBP is required for each one of those applications. The CBP, what it encourages is developers through this very specific framework to think about the impacts of their projects on communities, on workers, and then make commitments for how they might either address or improve benefits or kind of ameliorate some of the challenges associated with their projects. So from that vantage point, it's very interesting. You know, based on who we've spoken with and kind of what's been shared publicly, DOE has a number of goals with these CBPs. Everything from encouraging development that really links communities more directly to the needs of projects more directly to the needs of communities and workers, to increasing the deployment of clean energy technologies by reducing the risk and improving project viability. And then more broadly, as the funding is shared into clean energy, how do we ensure that there's a broader, more shared prosperity associated with those investments? So next slide, please. I'll briefly go on this. The way it works, and again, there's more research in the report, and DOE has provided a number of documents and instruction guides on this. There are three primary components for completing this community benefits plan that you then attach to your application. The first part is connected to research data, understanding and kind of analyzing the community that you're going to be in, the workforce that you're going to be reaching into, then planning that's connected to that analysis, and then finally commitments and implementation strategies that build on that planning and that analysis. So those three components of analysis, planning, and commitments are then applied across these four categories. So that developers through the CBP will need to address questions such as, what is your community engagement strategy? How have you done stakeholder mapping, and who are you talking to in your communities? What's your plan for engaging with organized labor? What types of jobs are you going to be creating? Which of these are going to be high quality jobs? What's your plan for training the workforce to be able to utilize those jobs? Will you be able to commit to things like a project labor agreement or community benefits agreement to support the workers and communities where these projects are going to be housed? How are you ensuring equitable access and inclusion to those jobs for underserved populations? What's the strategy for inclusion of minority and women-owned business enterprises? All of these questions are wrapped up in the community benefits plan. And so it requires a healthy amount of engagement and research, which in theory can lead to these very comprehensive and innovative alignments between the developer who's building a project and the community and the workforce connected to that project. What we wanted to do is talk to a number of folks, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. We wanted to talk to a few folks to understand what was happening on the ground. So we wound up, as I mentioned, talking with about 25 different stakeholders. We'll share some of the insights there, and then close with a few conclusions that links these insights to the other takeaways that Phil was sharing in the survey. So next slide, please. A couple of the, I think, more positive takeaways from our interviews were, one, the fact that the community benefit plans really are meeting one of their primary goals, which is developers who are connected and applying for DOE funding and therefore completing these community benefit plans were increasingly paying attention to community and workforce needs. That was going all the way up to the senior levels that we were hearing about, really kind of a much more attention and commitment to understanding project implications and project impacts on different stakeholders, as well as of a reorganization and an optimizing of units within developers who might be more directly connected to communities, and then connecting those folks with the engineering, more technical side of the business. So from that vantage point, we're already seeing, at least from the stakeholders we spoke with, early success in terms of how the CBP is impacting and encouraging developers to think about things a little differently. However, while folks saw the potential in the CBP, there's definitely some implementation challenges that early participants are experiencing. One is around the tight timelines that DOE is under. There's a need to, and I think different levels of pressure in getting lots of funding out the door. So the funding announcements come out with very short timelines for completing applications and submitting them back to DOE. That's creating a lot of challenges in terms of how communities are able to engage with this process. And it's really leading to a lot of crunches in terms of getting this research together and doing the planning and leading to thoughtful commitments and approaches with communities. There's also staffing and resource gaps that people are experiencing at DOE, which is putting more pressure on community groups and others that participate in the CBP process, because they're having to fill those gaps on their end. And finally, there's some concerns we heard about in terms of how CBPs are being reviewed and what the process is for the review of these applications and the scoring of the community benefit plans, and a lack of transparency around what that looked like. Next slide, please. Among the community-centered stakeholders we spoke with, again, an acknowledgement of the potential for the CBP, an excitement that DOE the Department of Energy is exploring this in such comprehensive fashion, but also a fair amount of growing frustration. One, and this is actually touched on in one of the early Q&A questions that I'm seeing, is because of the amount of outreach and engagement that the CBP is requiring of specific communities and community members and community stakeholders, there's growing stakeholder fatigue, because it's not just the CBP, it's also other federal agencies are doing their own outreach. That's creating a fair amount of difficulty and frustration and fatigue on the part of stakeholders in communities who aren't sure how quite to engage. There's also a misalignment between the best practices for more authentic patient community engagement that community stakeholders would like to see, and the type of engagement that tends to be practiced by developers who are moving quickly, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty around where a project might be sited. So that's definitely leading to some miscommunication and misalignment. All of this is hindering, I think, some of the strong build out of community and developer relationships that DOE was hoping for, and is certainly an area where folks would like to think about how they can address and improve that situation. I'll move a little faster here. The two other things that we heard, one is resources are a real need. That's a challenge at DOE because its ability to provide additional funding for community groups to engage and support specific community-driven processes is limited by law. Their funds are dedicated for very specific things, and it's a competitive grant process, so they can't do anything that would favor one or another applicant. So that is leading other folks to explore how they might access the additional funds that are needed to support community groups in participating, or some of the other stakeholders. Some of the needs that we've heard were for technical assistance to participate in the process. It's access to different information and data tools, mapping ability, which is called for in the CBP, and finally, longer-term capacity building that can allow for groups to participate in these processes in the long run. Definitely a lot of opportunity for philanthropy to play a role here, as well as other folks. Hey, Jeanette, can you still hear me? My screen just went blank. Oh, there we go. Okay,
Yes,
good.
we can hear you.
Sorry.
We can
Thank
hear
you.
you.
Sorry about that. Last slide. For me. So I think the last thing we'll say is on the accountability, which came up with a number of different discussions we had. DOE has been very public that the commitments made in a community benefit plan will be part of contractual obligations, and further funding from DOE for these projects will be contingent on developers meeting what they have committed to in their community benefits plan. So DOE has been very public about that. We also heard from stakeholders some concern about how those obligations would be met, how those obligations would be enforced, and also how you memorialize some of what's going to be in these community benefit plans. How do you memorialize authentic community engagement, as one person said? So definitely a lot of opportunity within the CBP. Some concern from stakeholders in this, and really hoping for transparent accountability mechanisms, including potentially publishing the CBPs once they've been agreed to, so folks can monitor. Last slide, and I think, Phil, maybe we'll just touch on this briefly. If you could go one more slide. I think you covered a couple of these. What we just wanted to say here is there's definitely an opportunity with the community benefit plans. We expect there could be some reservations from certain community members who are perhaps a little bit shy, scarred from experiences with the developers. Upfront engagement can be very supportive of trust building, really on the ground immersive approaches conducted as soon as possible, and finding ways to address that tension where there needs to be a patient, authentic engagement in communities, which doesn't necessarily square with how developers approach project development. Phil touched on the idea that there won't be a standard community benefit plans. There's going to need to be a tailored approach that appeals to different communities. I think, Phil, do you want to touch on the third point before we skip
Sure.
to the, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, it's really important to put into context that a community benefits plan can certainly help mitigate some challenges and bring the community into the development process, but it's not going to meet every community need. I mean, it's not going to get ambulances to show up when you call 911 when they don't currently. It's not going to clean up every park in a community. It's not going to create jobs for everyone who needs one. It's not going to solve homelessness and childcare, right? But it can be really an important tool that can help bring more benefits to communities where there's development, so it ends up being a good deal for those members.
Yeah, that's right. And the last thing we'll say, and then Jeanette, we'll turn it back to you, is to close on a positive note. Certainly there's certainly room for growth and opportunities to evolve the CBP. Not every CBP is going to be transformative in a specific community, but given the breadth of projects that we're talking about, given the amount of funding that's available, even incremental progress through the community benefits plans in terms of how clean energy and industrial development occur could be transformational across the scope of what we're talking about here. This can be a precedent-setting approach for how government invests going forward in clean energy. So understanding how this works and how to do it right is a really important next step. And with that, thank you very much for your time, everybody. Turn it back to you, Jeanette.
We take it from here. Thanks so much, Phil and Kai, for that excellent presentation. Now we're going to move on to our expert panel featuring Montina, Daniel, and Christina. I'll be moderating today. My name is Kara Hoving. I'm a Climate Equity Associate at Clean Air Task Force. And a reminder to everybody joining us today, if you joined a bit late, if you have questions for any one of our presenters or panelists, please feel free to pop it into the Q&A box, and a member of our team will address it either in the text, or we'll aim to have about 15 minutes at the end to address your questions. I see a couple people have already been popping some questions in there, so that's great. Keep them coming. So to start us off, I'd like to ask the three of our panelists to tell us a little bit about your work as it relates to community benefits, and how do the findings of these reports that Phil and Kai have just outlined for us, how do they reflect what you've seen in the field and in your actions with community members, energy developers, and policymakers? So Montina, why don't you start us off?
Sure, happy to. Thanks very much, Cara. It's really a pleasure to be here today with you and all my other great co-panelists and everybody who's tuning in today. Let me just first say briefly, if we're really serious about ensuring that we get the clean energy transition to be successful and equitable, if we're serious about making sure that everybody enjoys the benefits that clean energy transition can bring, that underserved and overburdened communities aren't overrepresented in bearing the harms and underrepresented in getting the benefits, then we have to have reports like these, and we have to have discussions around the issues raised by these kind of reports. And importantly, we have to have action around the issues that are raised. So I really commend the Clean Air Task Force for these new reports about the opportunities and the challenges presented by community benefit plans and community benefit agreements. The reports contain a lot of important findings, which we've just heard summarized so well, including things that are consistent with some of the things that I've seen over the years, and also some things that I'm seeing or hearing about today as the federal government is offering up billions of dollars in clean energy and decarbonization project funding opportunities. And one aspect of my work over the years has included addressing environmental justice and equity implications that arise when energy projects are at issue. The issue of community benefits typically arises, or should arise anyway, particularly when we're talking about the mitigation of energy project impacts when that's being considered. But we can't have the best sense of what community benefits a community might need or might desire without meaningfully engaging with the affected communities. And meaningful engagement is really a critical and foundational aspect of considering energy projects, making sure that we're engaging with communities with environmental justice concerns regarding a project. Yet, community engagement continues to be inadequately done by many project developers. And I think that some of the report findings really reflect this. And in fact, one of the survey findings directly shows that, as has already been mentioned, that there's a significant majority of the 3 communities looked at that feel like developers have not fulfilled promises in the past when there's been past developments, and that community engagement has been insufficient. There are many, many best practices that can be followed when we're talking about community engagement, like tailoring engagement efforts to address the particular needs of a community. Just because, I think has been reflected before in the discussion of the reports, environmental justice communities are not monolithic. So we have to make sure that we have authentic engagement. And if these sort of things don't happen, what happens is that it undermines trust, and it undermines the chance to garner community support of a project. And this is something that, certainly I've seen, and I think that we have all seen. So that even if there's a good clean energy project that's being proposed, there can still be this community history of bad experience with industry developers. So these type of things need to be addressed. Again, community engagement, meaningful engagement is really critical. And then just briefly, I'll mention one more of the survey findings that really spoke to me. And that's the finding around what are the most important benefits for the communities. And I think Kai or Phil may have mentioned this. It was really sobering to see that the desire for benefits like affordable housing requirements, or the desire for funding for mental health and substance abuse services, how those needs were ranked as very important and even higher than community member interest in having clean energy expansion. It was sobering, but not altogether surprising to me, and maybe not to all of us. This is a reality for people in communities that we have to be ready to deal with when we're engaging with communities, with underserved and overburdened communities. And it really reminded me of a project that I was involved with in the past several years ago. This was a gas pipeline case where, not surprisingly, the pipeline would run through an environmental justice community of color, many folks who are low income. And at one point, a community benefit agreement was floated regarding one of the communities. And this was a rural community. And one of the benefits proposed was to provide a nurse for the community. Because it turns out that this was something the community really needed, and they had expressed an interest in having. And at the time, I remember thinking, a nurse, really? Where's the government? Where's the county? Where's the state? Why aren't they providing basic medical support and services like nurses, let alone doctors and, hospitals? And it just, it hurt my heart to think about it still. It still hurts my heart to think about it. But I think that we need to really understand that these are realities that people are dealing with every day, and increasingly so in this country, and to be prepared for those sort of things to surface as we engage with the community. And to the extent possible, the community benefits plan process and community plan agreements should help to address community needs, either directly or indirectly, if they can. So that's another thing I just wanted to point out as something that really resonated with me in terms of the experience that I've had over the years. And again, thanks for these great reports.
Thank you so much. Christina, why don't you?
Yeah, happy to. And hello, everyone. Christina Angelides. I'm Managing Director of Policy at Elemental Accelerator, which, for those of you that don't know, we're a nonprofit investment organization with over a decade of experience. We help scale climate technologies with deep community impact. So we started about 10 years ago in Hawaii, working with companies and Native Indigenous Hawaiian communities, working with the Department of Navy and the U.S. Department of Energy. And we developed a project-based model for investment in climate tech companies, but to do so in a way that incorporated and equipped companies, supported community partnership, and therefore stronger equity outcomes and benefits from those projects. Since then, we've stewarded hundreds of millions of government and philanthropic funding to catalyze over 150 companies across the country undertaking climate projects in communities. Those companies have catalyzed, and those investments have catalyzed over $8 billion in co-investment and follow-on funding, and are funding projects across the country in every state. And so we've seen a lot of this. Part of our model, as I mentioned, really focuses on enabling entrepreneurs, companies, communities to achieve impact, including wealth generation, workforce development, and other community benefits. So over half of our companies in the portfolio are founders from traditionally excluded backgrounds, and over half of our companies also serve low to moderate income communities. We now have a requirement that all companies that receive investment from us have to design a project in partnership with a community-based organization or a set of community-based organizations. But previous to that requirement, about 2/3 of our companies work with community-based partners. And in year after year, companies provide sort of feedback through annual surveys to us saying that the work that we do with them to embed equity into their companies and then teach them how to partner effectively, what we call sort of equity in and equity out, is one of the most highly valued services that we provide. Over 90% of our companies say that working with a community-based partner was one of the most important things that helped transform their business development and their growth. So I'm really excited to see this report and just really appreciate the opportunity to be on the phone here with the fellow panelists from Clean Energy Task Force and other experts in the field like Montina and Daniel, and have long admired and worked closely with BW Research with Phil and Kai and the team there. And I think what you see in these reports is very much what we see on the ground, at Elemental being a climate investor and then a supporter of projects and wraparound services for deployments of those companies. We kind of sit in that in-between space of seeing both the company and technology innovation developer side and the community side. And we really help to sort of convene and create sort of the skill sets to be able to help those projects to catalyze that type of inclusion and participation and partnership and the outcomes that can result from it. And everything I think that we're seeing in these reports are things that we're seeing on the ground. And just to illustrate a few examples, we recently brought together some of our companies. We have an annual kind of convening of all of our companies, our 150 entrepreneurs. And some of the themes that we heard were very resonant about community benefit plans. It was one of the most talked about conversations in person in our recent summit. And there's concerns and almost freezing up that happens about when and how to go to communities to engage them, and how to be authentic in offering sort of the types of benefits that they can provide reasonably. Sometimes they're concerned about overpromising, not knowing what will happen with the government funding opportunities. they're not sure kind of when to go to them. And then often when sort of companies then get into the application process, it's almost too late to really identify real and meaningful ways to engage those communities. And so we're really starting to talk to companies about sort of an earlier launch point, how to sort of what they can within their own resources offer to those communities without overpromising and under delivering or disappointing, but being authentic and starting to build the trust early. We're also seeing a lot of problems with companies that they're not fully in control of all the elements that are needed to deliver those benefits. So we're seeing this a lot in apprenticeship programs where a lot of companies are reliant on contractors doing a lot of the work for them, and especially for earlier stage companies and new developing technologies, where they're already asking contractors to deviate from normal standards. It's really hard to then layer on requirements for apprenticeship and prevailing wage on top of that. So we're working a lot with companies on how to find and source the right types of contractors, kind of what are those issues that can help them to mitigate those issues earlier in the process so that they're not having to come down to the wire on certain decisions around contracting. And then there's really real trade-offs happening in terms of workforce, where some of the DOE funding opportunities are requiring or preferencing unionized labor, project labor agreements. But there are companies that in many instances support small business workers and communities and mom and pop businesses. And how do we balance some of those concerns and both provide that feedback to DOE so that we're preserving really important jobs, but also trying to get companies and local communities to reach towards higher standards of pay and protection for those workers. And then the last thing I think that we're seeing that really resonated with the reports was the scalability, that I think companies are really struggling to see how do they transfer sort of their projects and deployment models across communities while still being adaptive to local communities. So we have one company that's been installing energy efficient products and heat pumps in communities that, where in New York, the issues are about indoor air quality and housing quality, whereas in California, it's about workforce development and contractor opportunities. And how do they be adaptive and nimble to address those different concerns while still finding a scalable model? But amidst all of those issues, there's still a ton of successes. We've had a clean fuels production company that we helped embed equity and access into sort of the functioning of their company. When they went to go partner with a First Nation and heard feedback from the First Nation about the desire for long-term tribal ownership and operation, they completely redesigned their business and ownership model because of the training and because of the timeline and the experience and capacity that they had built in the organization. We've had a critical minerals extraction company who has started landscaping earlier to understand how they can partner with small business, mom and pop scrap yards to help those customers first, then helping major mining companies, helping scrap developers that are sending their material overseas, helping them keep that scrap metal here and extract critical metals that can be a new revenue source for those companies. And we've had heat pump companies who are engaging earlier and deploying first in public housing projects instead of high wealth and high net worth customers who are seeing their companies fueling growth, and so they're accelerating far beyond some of the other heat pump manufacturers right now by having a sort of a design approach on their technology, but also a financing and targeting market approach that focuses on low-income and disadvantaged communities that need adaptation and resilient solutions. So we're seeing that when we can provide these types of supports, when DOE can lean in, when other philanthropy, when supporters like us can lean in to provide those wraparound services, we're seeing different outcomes. And we're really excited about what the CBP process is creating, and that's cited in the report, and how we can continue to involve and create a stronger feedback loop between what's happening on the ground and what agencies are doing.
Thank you so much, Christina. Those were some really great examples. Daniel, I'll turn it over to you if you want to share some of your experiences.
Hi, well, I've been thinking about tribal community benefits for a long time, for over 30 years, since I first became a tribal leader. And you know, the idea of equity has been in my mind for a long time. What does that mean? And trying to create models for business development that actually positively impacts tribal communities for a long time. So initially, when the CBPs and the Justice 40 initiative came out from DOE, I was skeptical. I wasn't a big fan. But I came around after I talked with DOE and a lot of other folks, and have probably become the biggest supporter of CBPs. But I'm still skeptical. You know, because it was referred to earlier, I think by Phil, but in terms of DOE and some of the what they consider some of the impediments to what they can do, because they say their hands are tied when it, as an example, when it comes to helping provide technical assistance to stakeholders, because they can't pick, supposedly they can't pick winners and losers. But when it comes to tribes, as we know, there's a special relationship between the federal government and tribes. It's a trust responsibility. It's a fiduciary responsibility that other communities, states don't have with the federal government. And so how can the DOE, who's our fiduciary from the tribal perspective, tell us that we have to be treated equal? They can't give us any extra support that would give us a leg up when tribes are the one communities, or not the one, but on the bot we're collectively the most impacted community in terms of energy development, energy resource extraction from our reservations. You know, the collectively the largest landowners in the country besides the federal government, yet we're collectively the poorest. And how can that be when we still have hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars of resources, including critical minerals and other energy underneath our lands, yet we consistently are poor. And so, you know, like I said, it's a we look at it from a different, tribes look at it from a different perspective, right? From you know, Montina pointed out in her comments about some communities don't put in the environmental aspects at the top of their list, because housing and food, quality housing, jobs, money actually come out on top versus the environment, because they're so starved for these resources. And so you know, sometimes it doesn't logically correspond with how a lot of us think. And so, you know, like I said, the from my perspective, um community benefits plans, I think they're a good idea. I think that as we move forward, the it's something, these are something that the private sector, the states, localities need to take over. And I have optimism that they will continue. But one of the areas where I think there needs to be work is like it's been mentioned again, the time frame is very short on many of these grant opportunities, funding opportunities, and there's really no time. It's almost impossible for applicants, whether they're a developer, whether they're a community organization, whether they're a tribe, to fully engage. And it's nearly impossible. And so basically the applicant is deciding what they think is the best way to engage, not necessarily what the community thinks the best engagement is. And so it's not completely in line with those communities. And so what really needs to happen is a needs assessment prior to making the application. But again, there's no time. I'll quit with this comment, is that just the 21st, just a couple of days, just the last week, right before Thanksgiving, a grant opportunity came out with EPA, $2 billion grant that the application period is 1 year. So it's not due till November 21st of 2024. We've got a year to plan and apply. They're going to accept 150 applications are going to be accepted of between 10 and $20 million. It's a huge amount of money. But there's only 3 types of organizations that qualify: community organizations, community-based organizations, tribes, and colleges. And so what I fear is going to happen is that in chasing these dollars, we're actually going to go community shopping for pliant communities, pliant tribes that are going to be easy to partner with and access these funds. My hope is that over the next year, those applicants will properly engage with the communities, do a needs assessment to see actually what those communities need, and then actually work on doing positive and impactful CBPs. That's my hope. Like I said, I don't have much optimism that will happen, but so I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. It's really fascinating how we're all seeing very similar patterns across all of your different experiences, where you're seeing challenges related to meaningful community engagement, and both challenges and opportunities related to transferability and flexibility, and how to transfer lessons learned between different communities with different needs. And so we've mentioned needs assessments as one way to try and kind of get ahead of those challenges. So given all of those findings and all of those similarities that we've seen across the expert interviews and the community survey, what would you say are some of the, maybe 2 or 3 most important steps that developers can take right now, and also federal agency officials at DOE, steps that they can take to make sure that community concerns around the CBP are successfully addressed, and that this tool can achieve more equitable outcomes for environmental justice communities on the ground? Maybe just a couple sentences related to this question, and then we'll jump into the audience Q&A. Feel free to jump in if you have.
Oh, me? Okay, I'll just say really quick. I think that the CBPs need to be public. Every time I've asked the DOE about a specific applicant, when it announces, it makes a big thing about announcing all the funds that they're throwing out there, that how many jobs are created. Yet none of the CBPs are public knowledge, and so I'd say that the DOE, the applicants, that win the awards, need it on behalf of the communities, need to make those public so that those communities are aware of what's been promised, and so that it keeps their toes to the fire.
I think it's.
Oh, go
Oh,
ahead.
I'm so sorry. Go right ahead, Christina.
No, you go, Martina.
All right. Well, I'll be brief. I think when we're talking about developers, and again, I said this before, and I can't beat this drum enough, engage in meaningful community engagement. Now, it's been said that, DOE, the government's not giving us enough guidance. And it's true. We need more and more granular guidance, I would say. But the fact is, there actually are some good tools that DOE and other government agencies provide that give some best practices advice, and plus non-governmental information too. And I think it's in pretty much every one of the funding opportunity announcements. They have this community benefit plan guidance. And as part of these guidance documents, which are about, 50, 60 pages, there's a good chunk, a chapter that's just on community engagement. And there's really great advice and guidance there that can be used. And yes, a very small, short period of time. We understand we don't have enough time, but we have to do the best with what we have. The communities can't wait, the climate can't wait, so we have to move fast. And I actually provided, Cara, if you have a chance, maybe before we're done, just to put a link to that DOE, an example of one of those guidance documents. I think that's really important. And just top line kind of things. Have a community engagement plan. Do some research in the beginning, a little initial research to find out about the community. Find out about what the history is in that community with other developers. People haven't normally been engaged before, find out who those people are and try to remove barriers to their participation, understanding that no community is the same. Communities aren't monolithic. So certain communities, you may need to do outreach and engagement with them in a certain way, maybe more virtual as opposed to in person. Maybe you need to provide childcare when you're going to have meetings with the communities, things like that. So get really kind of innovative and thinking outside the box and do what's called, as DOE would say, two-way engagement. So we're not just coming in doing the traditional, oh, here's an open house. We want to have something that's going to facilitate dialogue back and forth and make sure that the feedback that they provide will make a difference so that, but the ultimate outcomes are different than if you had not had community engagement. So it has to be something that's really meaningful and effective. And I think that I'll stop there. I could talk about DOE and just real quickly, I would think that DOE really needs to amplify the tools that they have now, and then also maybe provide some more case studies, webinars, what have you, to amplify and make more specific. But those are the two things I would say would be important for developers and then also for DOE.
I think the reports identify a number of really important recommendations, which upon reflection, I really feel hold true from my experience working with companies on the ground and with community partners that they're working with on those projects. I think if I were to, really emphasize, a few of those, in particular, just investing within the organization and the company early, equity in training, capacity building, identifying who is the staff that's going to own that type of engagement, and really resourcing, even if you don't have sort of the funding to create a community engagement apparatus, whether that's the marketing person, the HR person, whoever it is owns that, and that their CO leadership and commitment has been one of the most critical factors, because once you get on the ground, that's when the tough issues happen, when you're having to weigh these concerns, talk with your investors about it, going back to the drawing board about sort of siting and sort of ownership models. Things get tough, and having a CEO that's going to sit there and engage and be thoughtful is one of the most critical kind of difference makers we've seen on the ground. And so investing in that within the organization and seeing it as a competitive advantage for your company right now in this space and in the government funding opportunities that are out there right now is something that's really resonating, I think, with a lot of developers that we're working with. And then I think that another thing that the report mentioned is broadening early landscape and assessment. One thing that we in developer speak, everyone understands sort of pre-development and kind of development assessments. And thinking about community engagement as one of those things. It's not just about engineering and law and siting and getting your entitlements right. It's about doing your homework on the community and engaging and finding who are the critical stakeholders. And some of the things that we point people to is a lot of the government tools, like the climate environmental justice screening tool to identify communities where you can cite and what are the issues, and whether it be pollution or air quality or other legacy issues that those communities are dealing with. Equipping them with that kind of knowledge and those research tools, to the DOE sort of guide on community benefits. There's a lot of tools out there that we're pointing to companies that are proving to be really, really helpful right now. On the DOE side, I think the thing I would emphasize, and again noted in the report, is looking at sort of seed funding opportunities to fund this type of early engagement and support. And also just not thinking about the grant capital ways that you can do that, but also the other types of financing mechanisms. So right now, Elemental is experimenting with a convertible note that provides early working capital at below market rates that allows companies to both invest in other pre-development services, but this being one of those pre-development services that we require them to do. And so they can get kind of concessionary capital rates. And so there might be multiple types of mechanisms to fund this type of work, not through grant dollars, that might also be more long-term systemically possible beyond even sort of the agency, that, banks, green banks, CDFIs, and a range of other stakeholders could come in to support. And so that's something I think that's really exciting. And I hope DOE could help convene and start to think about experiment. They're doing a lot with prizes and challenges that can also inspire people and really motivate more work beyond just talking about it on paper. And we're really excited to see them doing more of that, as the report mentions. And then I think the last thing I would just mention is just being earlier sightline on the NOFOs. I know we've talked about this a lot. By the time the NOFO hits, that's usually too late in our experience. And so ways that DOE could give earlier indications about what could be in NOFOs. We've seen different agencies start to experiment this with early kind of implementation guidance being put out. DOE has started to do this with earlier RFIs, and being very specific, but also flexible about what outcomes could be sought. Because as we've seen on the ground, community by community, those differences can be quite vast. And so also not trying to be too blunt in terms of hammering one solution when we know that there's a variety of needs and approaches that are required to reach the Justice 40 outcomes that we in the administration desire to achieve.
Thank you so much for those thoughtful responses. I think we have time for one question from the Q&A. I think I've been seeing a lot of questions related to that problem that was raised earlier by Phil and Kai about stakeholder fatigue, and how we, make sure that we're doing effective community engagement without overburdening the communities that are being engaged. If you have any thoughts on that.
From Elemental standpoint, this is one of the things we really feel very strongly about. Part of our milestone-based payments when we fund companies is we not only provide them milestones towards their technology and project development goals, but also to community engagement. And a requirement is that they flow through some of the funding they receive to us to contracts to community-based organizations and partners. So they compensate those partners to do that work. And that's a big part of this. And I think a lot of companies and developers underestimate. I think they think it needs to be a big ticket size and not understanding that there's some of that funding can be very, very valuable and important to those community-based organizations that are incredibly stretched, far beyond many of the startups and developers that are in the space right now. And I think the other thing that we approach is just honorariums when they're doing assessments and going into communities, paying people for their time and their perspectives, even if it's not a long-term based contract, but inviting them not just for, a meal or to provide, other support, but paying them for their time and compensating them in ways that are meaningful to them to provide that input and feedback are some of the practices that we are really pushing developers to practice as they're scoping these projects and implementing them.
I think that Christina really just hit a very key issue on the head. I can't, she said it well. It's so critical. And I think in addition to that, I would say too, that philanthropy really has a role here to help get more resources to community organizations, whether that's additional staffing or additional consultants or some combination, because we do have this short time period, right? This crunch period. So maybe some sort of surge funding, right? To just get more bodies to help, because it's one thing to pay folks and compensate them for the time, which is Christina well said is needed. But I think that there's also just a need for more capacity in terms of more people to help out too. So I think philanthropy has a role there. And I know that they're doing some things to help, which is great, but more needs to be done.
And I'd say, from the tribal perspective, there's 574 federally recognized tribes, but only a third of tribal people actually live on a reservation. So it means, or 30%. So 70% of tribal people live outside of reservations. And so we're a diverse community. And we're finding, and I'm glad that the philanthropy was mentioned, and the idea that you need to pay folks. But one of the things that we're finding is that with tribes, the idea is that we have these, there's a concept in Indian country about sovereignty, and that each tribe makes its own decisions for its own best interest. So there's 574 diverse interests in our community, plus, and many of those tribes are still engaged in fossil energy, right? So when we're talking about energy transition, equitable transition. A lot of tribes operate at their own speed, and when we're talking about transitioning, indigenous and tribal communities have probably made a lot of the, we've shared a lot of burdens in terms of extraction over the last 200 years, and so we've given up a lot. That this is a perspective from our community, and so when we're asked to continue to give up within the energy transition, to give up fossil energy production for green energy, tribes want to do it at their pace, not the pace of greater society or COP28 or whoever decides these things. And so it's at a slower pace. And so what I'm finding is that some very large philanthropies are coming in with tens of millions of dollars and basically throwing this money around to get what they want done in the context of helping tribes. And the optics seem as though they're paying tribes or tribal communities to do the right thing, even though it's not at their time frame. And so that's the to me, one of the flip side, the other side of the coin with some of the money coming from the philanthropies is that it just seems as though they're buying favor instead of allowing the tribes, again, using our community as an example, allowing the tribes to develop support for the energy transition at their pace. And so I see this happening. I think it's good. The federal government's not coming in and helping these communities, especially with capacity building and the technical assistance that's needed to not only go after grants and awards, but just in general to understand the energy transition. What does it mean? What is CO2? What is hydrogen? What are these processes? That all these terms and this information that's being thrown at our community, when we're more worried about where our next meal is going to come from, or if there's a roof over our head. This kind of thing sometimes is not, like I said, our top priority, but so that's all in there. So I'm glad that it was mentioned, the philanthropy. I think they're really important as we move forward, but sometimes it can be it's a double-edged sword. So
Thank you so much. Well, we're out of time. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of our expert panelists and our presenters for all of your thoughts and insights. This was a great discussion. We'll be sending out a recording of the presentation and copies of the 3 reports on CBPs and CBAs to everybody who registered. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.